Well, hello again. Welcome back. Just a few reminder about a couple of technical issues that I mentioned before. One of them is that presentations will be in English or Spanish, and for participants who wish to hear the interpretation, you will find an icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. And during the presentations this morning, your cameras and microphones will be off. You can send your questions to Q&A. Since we might receive many questions, as with the speech of Peter Diamond happened, we apologize in advance for not being able to respond to all of them. We are going to include as many questions as time allows us. Again, and before we move forward, however, we would like to know who is in the room with us. Again, a question will pop up on your screen right now, asking you about the role that each of you are playing in your country. Here is. Take a minute, please, to answer this question, and we are looking forward to your answers. Okay, that's fine. So let's move on to the next presentation. Just let me say hello to some of our participants that has been, they have been key participants in other sessions, in other editions of the GPP, as Carlos Ramirez or Maria Milian. Thank you very much for being with us today as well. Once again, I invite you to ask your questions to this webinar by sending them via the Q&A sessions. I will read all your questions, or at least all that I can read him to Nick to present it. Nicholas Barr, it's a really pleasure for me to introduce Nick. He's Professor of Public Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He holds a Master in Science in Economics from LSE and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He's author of numerous books and articles on the economics of the welfare state and the finance of higher education, including the economics of the welfare state and reforming pensions, principles and policy choices, co-author with 2010 Nobel laureate Peter Diamond, our former invite. As said before, which I have had the honor of translating into Spanish. He's a member of the editorial board of the International Social Security Review and associate editor of the CIFO Economic Studies, the Australian Economic Review, and the Journal of Economics of Aging. His teaching includes public economics, the economics of the welfare state, political economy of post-communist transition, and topics in public policy. And he has been a flagship of this program since its beginning. Nick, please.
Can you unshare your screen? Aha, there we go. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Diego. It's very good indeed to be back in harness together again. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. It's very good to be back as part of the Global Pension Programme. My talk, as Peter Diamond has indicated, draws very much on our joint work, and my talk is essentially a complement to Peter's. What I'd like to do is a few lessons from economic theory, because that's important for setting the scene, and then some examples of good practice in designing DC pensions, some in not so good. So starting with lessons from economic theory, the simple theory assumes what economists call a first best world. That's a world where everyone is well informed about their future needs and circumstances. They know all about financial markets and financial products. They have a long time horizon. They act in accordance with long-run rationality. And that's a simple, elegant, powerful model, but it's not a model that describes the world as it is. What's needed is what economists call second best analysis, which addresses problems like imperfect information and non-rational behavior, search frictions, incomplete markets, incomplete contracts, and distortionary taxation, for which, as my slide shows, multiple Nobel Prizes have been awarded this century. And you may say, why am I going on about these Nobel Prizes? The reason is, the point I want to make is what I'm going to be talking about is not some peculiar, idiosyncratic Nick Barr or LSE view of the world. It's rooted in the very best of modern economics. So the basic point is that the simple model is right for an imaginary world, but given the complexities of reality, it's a bad basis for policy design. So digging into some of these problems, let me start with lessons from information economics. As an example, in a pensions context, in a survey, 50% of Americans didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. Now, at this stage at LSE, I look at my students and I say, now put your hand up if you really know the difference. You're really sure you know the difference between a stock and a bond. And about a third of hands go up, and another third sort of go up, but they're not quite sure. Now, if students at the London School of Economics are not absolutely sure about a distinction as basic as that, then clearly that's not a good basis on which to formulate policy in complex areas like pensions. Second example, most people don't understand the need to shift from equities to bonds as they age. I remember a tragic item on the BBC News in the autumn of 2007, where one of their interviewers was talking to an elderly American car worker at Detroit, who was saying that he'd lost about 1/3 of his pension savings in the previous 2 weeks. And my reaction at the time was, what a bad pension system that allows a worker like that still to be in the stock market that close to retirement. And as a third example of poor information, most people don't realize how hugely important administrative charges are for pensions. If your pension fund has an annual management charge of 1%, then over the course of a full career, your accumulation will be about 20% smaller just because of that 1% charge, which doesn't sound like very much, but it really accumulates. And I will come back later on to the significance of administrative charges. So imperfect information is one problem. Non-rational behavior is another. Simple theory predicts that as a rational person, I would choose voluntarily to save the optimal amount at each stage in my working life, and then I would choose to retire at the optimal time and convert the optimal fraction of my pension savings into an annuity. And I would choose an annuity type that optimizes for me. But that isn't what happens. At least two problems. What economists call bounded rationality. That problem arises where the problem is too complicated for someone to be sure what they ought to be doing. And that manifests itself in problems like procrastination. People know they ought to be saving more, but they delay starting. There's inertia. People stick where they are. In theory, it shouldn't make a difference if you put somebody into a pension plan and say, if you want to get out of it, you have to do some paperwork, or whether you don't put them into the pension plan and say, if you want to join, you need to do some paperwork. But as we all know, plans with automatic enrollment have much higher participation rates. A third manifestation of bounded rationality is immobilization. People simply do nothing. They're like rabbits in a car headlight. And one of the reasons for that is if you're a worker in Sweden, this is a point I shall come back to later, you, in part of their pension setup, you have the choice of choosing a pension fund from over 800 different funds. And that's, in a way, an impossible problem, even for a financially literate person. And as a result, 90% or more go into their default fund. So bounded rationality is one manifestation of non-rational behavior. The other is bounded willpower, which is what arises where somebody knows what they ought to do, but they don't do it. So people know they ought to save, and they ought to save more, but they don't save, or they don't save enough. And there's explanations for this. Why do people behave that way? Well, there's a famous experiment. In that experiment, as you came in from your coffee break after Peter Diamond's talk to listen to mine, you signed up for your snack for the next seminar. And you had a choice between fruit salad and chocolate, and 2/3 of you chose fruit salad because you know that that's the healthy option, and the other third chose chocolate. But as you came into the room, there was a table with fruit salad and chocolate on it. And 1/3 of you chose fruit salad, 2/3 of you took the chocolate. And what that says is people are rational for the future, but not for the present. When faced by the choice between fruit salad and chocolate, people fall for the chocolate. I don't blame them. So they're rational for the future, but not the present. But when the future arrives, it becomes the present. So the short term wins. You've got a time inconsistency. And to illustrate how bad the problems can be, this comes from a study by Anna Maria Lusardi and Olivia Mitchell. We'll be hearing from Olivia later in the week. And this was an international survey of financial literacy that was designed to be comparative across countries. And participants were asked 3 questions. And I'm just going to ask you the first one. You've got $100 in a bank account. It pays 2% interest a year. After 5 years, how much would you have in the account? Would you have less than $102, equal to $102, more than $102, or you don't know? And the other 2 questions were equally simple. Now, in the US, the heart of capitalism, about 35% of respondents got all 3 answers correct. And in perfectly sensible, well-run countries with good education systems like Sweden, Japan, and New Zealand, only about 25% of respondents got the answer to all 3 questions right. So what that says is that financial literacy is shockingly limited. And it gets worse. The previous slides are about people who can't make good decisions. But there's also people who possibly do have the knowledge to make good decisions, but they don't. This is behavior by people who are financially knowledgeable, but they don't focus on it given time constraints or energy constraints or the attractions of football or their grandchildren. And this is very widespread. In the typescript of the book that Peter Diamond and I are currently writing, there is a sentence that says, many people don't review their pension arrangements often enough. And then there's a footnote which says, this is true of both of the authors of this book. I know I should be reviewing my pension arrangements more often, but I'd rather be writing with Peter. I'd rather be seeing our grandchildren. There's sport on television, even during lockdown. So you've got 2 problems. There's a can't problem and there's a won't problem. And then if I have time at the end, there's one more slide which says, actually, however knowledgeable you are, it's to a large extent an impossible problem. So what do those lessons from economic theory imply for policy design? First lesson, giving people less choice is part of good policy design. The second is don't overstate what financial education is capable of achieving. Financial education is enormously important. It should be mandatory in schools. Young people need to learn that maxing out on credit cards is a thoroughly bad idea. But there's a limit to what financial education can achieve, and one should be realistic about that. A third lesson is that people do respond to incentives up to a point, but not as much as people think. Fourth lesson, very important one, is that simple reliance on the model of choice and competition is misplaced. Pensions are complex, and systems in which workers have to choose from competing private providers face information problems, behavioral problems, high administrative costs. Now, that's not a condescending remark by an elderly professor of economics. None of us, in whichever country we are today, can go into the pharmacy and buy any pharmaceutical drugs we like over the counter. We need a letter from our doctor because, for reasons we all understand, this is an area that's too complex for consumer sovereignty to be very useful. And as an illustration in terms of pensions, a few years ago, I was asked to write a report on the pension system in Sweden. And the night before I launched the report, I was having dinner in Stockholm with 2 old friends, one of them very senior in running the pension system in Sweden, and the other one of the key people who'd been involved in designing it. And I was saying to them that if I were a Swedish worker, having to choose from over 800 pension funds, I said, I wouldn't have a clue about which is a good pension fund. I said, I'd be in the default fund. And they looked at me, the person running the system, the person who'd helped design it. They looked at me and they laughed and they said, we're in the default fund. Which makes the point that even if you are very knowledgeable, being given less choice is helpful. So the key, an important conclusion, the simple model of choice and competition is the wrong one. It uses a first best model in second best circumstances. So that then brings us on to, with that as background, on to what does this tell us about good design of defined contribution pensions? And the central argument is that, first of all, where people want to make choices, pension design should help them. But you should design the pension system to work well for people who make no choice, and making no choice should be an entirely socially acceptable option. So what I want to do is to talk about two examples of good practice. The first one is simple savings plans, and the second one is the idea of collective individual defined contribution pensions. So starting with simple savings plans, one of the problems we're facing is declining birth rates in many countries. And the response to that, part of the response, is more saving. Declining fertility means the workforce in future will be smaller than it is today. So a rational response is to make each individual member of that smaller workforce more productive by increased investment in human capital and physical capital. So to that end, higher savings matters. And that's where some people say, well, that's why we need to have individual funded accounts to increase saving. But that's only part of the story. Funded individual accounts are one way to organize saving, but not the only way. You can increase savings within the pension system or outside the pension system. Options inside the pension system include fully funded individual accounts from competing providers, such as in Chile and Australia. Or you can have simpler, cheaper individual accounts with less choice, examples that I will talk about in a few minutes, including the US Thrift Savings Plan and Nest pensions in the UK. Or you can have industry plans that are fully funded, as in the Netherlands. Or you can have NDC pensions with some funding to provide a buffer, as in Sweden, as Peter talked about. Or you can have national defined benefit pensions that are partially funded on a longer term basis, and Peter Diamond talked about Canada as an example. Or you can have partially funded defined benefit pensions with some risk sharing, such as in the Canadian province of New Brunswick. So you can increase savings in many ways within the pension system, or you can increase savings outside the pension system. Through government debt is one way, or through a sovereign wealth fund. So what does that tell us for the design of defined contributions? To me, there's 4 practical lessons. First of all, you make membership of the plan mandatory, or you have automatic enrollment. If you leave it on a voluntary basis, or you rely too much on incentives, people aren't going to save, or they're not going to save enough. Secondly, you need a single default so that a worker whose saving is mandatory, but who doesn't choose a pension fund or pension provider, goes into the default. And that default should be life cycle profiled. In other words, it should automatically move a worker from more equities towards more bonds as he or she approaches retirement age. The third element is, around the default, have a simple choice architecture. As I mentioned earlier, highly constrained choice is a deliberate design feature. You can have some choice within the default, as in the design in Sweden, or you can have limited choice additional to the default, as in nest pensions, which I will discuss shortly. So mandatory or automatic enrollment, a single default, a single simple surrounding choice architecture, and fourthly, low administrative costs. And the way to achieve that is to decouple two aspects of pensions. The first is account administration. That's the record keeping, the back office stuff. And that should be centralized because there's economies of scale. Fund management could be done wholesale on a competitive basis, as in the thrift savings plan or nest pensions, or it could be done through a sovereign wealth fund, for which the closest example is Norway. So some practical examples. The US thrift savings plan is the plan for US federal civil servants. It's got automatic enrollment. It was initially voluntary, but it has since moved to automatic enrollment. Workers have a choice of 5 funds, for example, an equities fund, a government bonds fund, a corporate bonds fund, etc. The record keeping is centralized and fund management is wholesale. So that's, if you like, the very simplest design. The UK National Employment Savings Trust, known as Nest Pensions, is a more modern example. It's been phased in over the last 8 years. And this has a similar design to the thrift savings plan, in particular in the way it offers only limited choice. So it's a similar design to the thrift savings plan for similar reasons, drawing on the findings of behavioral economics. Now, my message is a country doesn't have to have a system of funded individual accounts as part of its pension system. But if it does want funded individual accounts, then the thrift savings plan nest approach is the way to do so. Now, when I come on to the not so good, I'm going to give examples of how the UK can get things wrong on pensions. And the UK sadly offers many examples of how to get things wrong, but nest pensions are an exception. And a point worth noting is nest pensions don't have to be instead of other pension plans. They can be there as well as other pension plans, which is the way they operate in the UK. 4 key elements: automatic enrollment, a simple surrounding choice architecture, centralized account administration, wholesale fund management. Going through those in slightly more detail, workers are automatically enrolled in a simple in nest pensions, and they are then, if they do nothing, put into the default. And the default is a target date fund, the target date being being the state pension age in Britain. And the default fund has got 3 phases. The first phase, the foundation phase, is the first 5 years or so. And this element is a novelty in pension design. Losses in the early years are profoundly discouraging, particularly in a plan that's with auto-enrollment rather than being mandatory. So the strategy during the early phase is to make sure that the value of the accumulation doesn't go down. Once the saving habit is established, then the fund moves into the growth phase, which adopts a less conservative approach with an age-related mix between equities and bonds. And the aim of Nest, which so far has been successful, is to produce a long-term average annual net real return of 3%. And then the third phase, as a worker approaches retirement, gradually starts to crystallize the gains by moving into more into bonds. Alongside the default, a worker can choose from 5 funds. There's a higher risk fund with potentially higher growth. There's a lower growth, hence lower risk fund. There's an ethical fund. There's a Sharia fund, and there's a pre-retirement fund. So a worker who makes no choice goes into the default. A worker who wishes to choose a fund can choose from one of those 5. A worker has 2 other choices. As I say, the target date is his or her, is the year in which the worker reaches state pension age, but the worker has the option to choose a different target date. So if, for example, I want to increase my exposure to risk, I can select a target date later than the year in which I reach state pension age, or vice versa if I'm more risk averse than average and want lower risk. And secondly, I can choose whether to delay my retirement beyond state pension age. So default, some limited choice. Account administration is centralized. Nest maintains all the individual records. It decides in-house on how to divide savings between building block funds and asset classes, and it does some of that fund management in-house, and it procures private sector fund management of others, and it publishes quarterly updates for which I've given the link. The charges for employers, Nest is a 100% online platform. Employers face compliance costs but have no charges to pay. Members pay an annual management charge of 0.3%, which is what they managed to achieve in Sweden. In addition, there's a temporary 1.8% charge on contributions. And the reason for that is the following. Nest competes with private pensions, privately managed pensions. Nest was set up by government, and the setup costs came from a loan from the British government to Nest Pensions, but to create a level playing field with private providers, Nest has to repay that loan. So this is a temporary charge until the loan has been paid off. Once that's been paid off, that charge will disappear, and members will face only the annual management charge of 0.3%. The approach respects the lessons from the economics of information and behavioral economics that I talked about earlier. It simplifies the choice for workers. It's got automatic enrollment. Essentially, it complies with what in many ways I think is my key message today. Keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple for the worker. And Nest Pensions does that. And it keeps administrative costs low. And importantly, in economic terms, it locates competition in the right place. Fund management has the hugely important purpose of allocating people's savings to productive investment use. But it does that more effectively if you've got competition in the right place. And the right place is between fund managers who are knowledgeable and pension plan managers who are knowledgeable. So you've got decisions made in a market where both sides are knowledgeable. Whereas if you've got competition between fund managers who are knowledgeable and individual workers who are generally not, that's what leads to inefficient outcomes, bad outcomes, some of which I shall come on to when I talk about the less good aspects of pension design. So simple, cheaply administered savings plans is one example of good design. Second one is what are called collective individual defined contribution plans, as opposed to individual defined contribution plans. This is a proposal in the Netherlands. It's a proposal, it hasn't yet been enacted. The idea is that this design has the main characteristics of an individual funded defined contribution account, but where the investment decisions are centralized. So the worker isn't choosing a portfolio or a plan manager. A worker, and so the core elements are you've got centralized investment, Each member has an individual account. You can have a design where there is one fund that people belong to, or you can give people a choice from a small number of different funds. And an illustration of the approach, and I've realized this only quite recently, is that Nest target date funds are an illustration of the approach, because they're a worker who makes no decision goes into the default, so you've got collective investment. A worker can choose one of the other funds, but then within that fund, investment is done on a collective basis. And this is good design for broadly the same reason as the previous slide. It's simple, it keeps administrative costs low, and it locates competition in the right place. So this is the good news. You know, there are good designs out there. There are designs that genuinely address the information and behavioral problems that I've talked about. The bad news is that that's more or less all the good news. You've got examples of not so good design. And what I've talked about are elements of good design in a DC plan: mandatory or automatic enrollment, a single default, a simple surrounding choice architecture, and low administrative costs. And unsurprisingly, all the examples I'm going to talk about next go against those implications. And I want to talk first of all about excessive costs and charges, and then about the problems that arise with too much choice. The fund expense ratio has two elements. It includes a fund's transactions costs before it deducts charges, so dealing costs, any stamp duty, etc. And it includes an annual management charge. And in Hong Kong in 2016, the average fund expend ratio was 1.39%. Now, imagine that that expense ratio is zero. For example, if an employer pays charges, and think of a worker who accumulates $100,000, then what's available for the worker to finance consumption after retirement? With a zero charge, the worker has £100,000. In Hong Kong, the worker has only about $70,000. So $30,000 have never got from the worker in his or her working years to him or herself in retirement. In Sweden and in the target for UK Nest pensions, of the $90,000, of the $100,000 the worker accumulates, approximately 93,400 gets through to the worker in retirement. So costs and charges really matter. And one of the sources of high costs is too much choice. And I want to talk about three examples. There's drawdown in the UK, there's accumulation in Australia, and accumulation in part of the pension system in Sweden. The UK story, I think, is a sad one. Up to 2014, a worker with a defined contribution accumulation in Britain had to convert at least 75% into an annuity. So the worker could take up to 25% as a tax-free lump sum. The other 75% had to be annuitized. In 2014, the Minister of Finance, note, not the pensions minister, but the Minister of Finance, announced that annuities were a bad deal for consumers because they were expensive. And he was right in that. That was a correct diagnosis. But he then went on to say, therefore, we're going to abolish the requirement to annuitize. So he was saying to workers, you needn't buy an annuity at all. And furthermore, you can draw down your pension savings as fast as you like. So on the day you reach earliest pension age, if you want to take a large chunk of your pension savings and buy a Rolls-Royce, you're free to do so. Now, as I've said, this was the Minister of Finance without consultation, not the pensions minister. And the problems were entirely predictable, that there would be high charges for undrawn down products, there would be mis-selling, there would be fraud and scams. Some people would draw down too fast, others would draw down too slowly. Some people draw down too slowly because they're worried about running out of money. Others, if they are spending money from a pension accumulation rather than via an annuity, will feel constrained because, as they put it, they're quote unquote spending their children's inheritance. And there is evidence that some people did draw down too fast. In the UK, 40% of holders of individual accounts withdrew 8% or more of their accumulation each year, which is on average unsustainable. So it was the right diagnosis, it was the wrong prescription, the process was wrong because it was the finance minister without consultation. And a better way forward would have been either curated drawdown. In other words, you give people guidance on how fast they draw down. In the US, there is a tax penalty if you draw down too quickly. There's a tax penalty if you draw down too slowly. And that at least gives people guidance. Or you could do what they do in Sweden and have government-provided annuities. Or more radically, the government could introduce longevity bonds. And longevity bonds, there is an incomplete market for annuities because remaining life expectancy at pension age, I would argue, is more an uncertainty than a risk. So sellers price conservatively. So there is potentially a reform role for longevity bonds. And let me park that. And if anybody wants me to amplify in Q&A, I'm happy to do so. So this quote from Martin Wolf in the Financial Times tells a powerful story. With the quote unquote right fee structure, mediocre investment managers may become rich as they ensure that their investors cease to remain so. And the cutting from the Times makes the point that once a worker can draw down their pension accumulation as they like, then they become targets for people selling fake products, high charge products, or outright fraudulent products. Now it gets worse. Let me explain to you the strategy of UK pensions. And basically what it says is, until age 55, you are ignorant and stupid and short-sighted, and you don't understand financial products and you don't understand financial markets. And therefore, we've got to nudge you into an auto-enrollment plan like Nest. But suddenly, when you reach minimum pension age of 55, on your 55th birthday, you become wise and knowledgeable and far-sighted, and therefore you can now be given the freedom to make your own choices about drawdown. And this quote sums it up beautifully. It says, unless the government beefs up guidance, new pension freedoms could undermine auto-enrollment and leave us with a pensions crisis. If the government was worried about obesity, but simultaneously handing out free sweets, in other words, free candy, you'd have to question either their motives or their competence. But that's exactly what the government has done with pensions. Auto-enrollment largely exists because we believe that people are either incapable or unwilling to save for their future. At the same time, freedom and choice makes the assumption that people are capable of good decisions about retirement. It doesn't take a behavioral economist to tell you something's not right here. The two policies aren't just contradictory, they're underpinned by diametrically opposed assumptions about the way people think. Now, I've said in a way my main message is keep it simple, stupid. But another main message which the UK Incoherence highlights is that one needs to think about pensions holistically and with a long-term view. And if you have pension reform done in bits and pieces, then you can end up, as in the UK, with two bits that are strategically completely at odds with each other. So there's one example of not so good design, pension freedom in the UK. Another example is Australia, with many funds and multiple defaults. And because of many funds, you've got high charges. This is a quote from an Australia Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking Superannuation and Financial Services industry. It says, quote, "The practice of charging fees for no service has been endemic in the financial advice industry." Now, of course, in Australia, some funds do well, but a significant number do really badly, and fees remain a significant drain on a worker's net returns. Now, the argument for having multiple defaults was the argument of competition. Competition will drive down charges, it will motivate high performance. But in complex areas like pensions, that's a first best argument in a second best context. So it's simply misplaced to make that argument. So these things result from inadequate competition, inadequate governance, and inadequate regulation. So that's example 2 of not so good. And therefore, when Peter Diamond and I were asked to advise an Australian inquiry, we made recommendations that by now should be very familiar, given all that I've said over the last 40 minutes or so. A single default, a simple choice architecture within the default, one account per person to avoid lost accounts and keep administrative costs low, and a central administrative agency. Third example of not so good, Sweden. Sweden is mixed. There's a huge amount of good, but there's some that's not so good. The good is a single well-designed default and a simple choice architecture within the default, and a central administration, a central clearinghouse to channel contributions to pension providers, and low charges negotiated by government with private providers as a quid pro quo for allowing them access to the central clearinghouse. What's less good is that outside the default, as I've mentioned, a worker has to choose from over 800 funds, and that's far too many. And in my earlier report, I said that was far too many. Quality assurance has been light touch. So there's been some fraud. And Peter Diamond and I earlier this year responded to a government inquiry supporting the idea that there should be fewer funds. There's one other bit of Sweden that's not so good, and this refers directly to Manuel Huitron's question to Peter about whether one should raise earliest pension age or rely on incentives. In Sweden, you can collect your pension from the age of 61. At that age, the pension you get depends, other things equal, on the remaining life expectancy of your birth cohort. So as people live longer and longer, the pension you get at age 61 goes down. And therefore, the argument is a rational response is workers would then delay retirement. But that, again, is a first best argument. And workers typically don't do that, which is why I argued in my 2013 report, and have done so since, is that as well as adjusting a person's pension to the life expectancy of his birth cohort, one needs, in addition, to raise earliest pension age in some sensible way as life expectancy goes up. So that's the second bit of Sweden that is not so good. But like the too many funds, those are both, if you've got problems, those are good problems to have because they can be fixed relatively easily. You don't have to completely change the system or have radical reform. You can adjust the system. So, conclusion, mistakes to avoid. The first one is not having a central administrative agency. Second is having too much, giving workers too much choice. And the third is having not enough and not strong enough regulation of providers. In other words, weak quality assurance. Now, the first two, not having a central administrative agency and giving workers a lot of choice, those two are likely to lead to unnecessarily high administrative costs. Too much choice with insufficient regulation creates a worry that there's going to be scams, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be high quality, high price, low quality products sold. So the bottom line is designs that uncritically accept the model of choice and competition are adopting old think. So let me leave it there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Nick. Amazing, as usual. There's a lot of questions for you. Let me start with some of our attendees ask for a little bit explanation about longevity bonds.
Right. Okay. A long time ago, when retirement age was 65, and the remaining life expectancy of people at 65 was 5 years, you could price annuities on the basis that the average worker would live on average for another 5 years. And that was a risk. Now, with risk, insurers have a reasonably good idea of the probability distribution of outcomes. With uncertainty, they know that there is a they know that there is a risk, but they can't quantify it well. 5 years after pension age is a risk. If today a worker retires at 65, he or she could well be working, live for another 30 years. And that's more of an uncertainty. So faced by uncertainty, annuity sellers price annuities conservatively, which is why the British Finance Minister rightly said annuities didn't offer a good deal. One way to deal with that is the government, just as the government sells indexed government bonds, which insurers can buy to hedge against the inflation risk, the government could sell longevity bonds. And there, the way that works is that if I am an annuity seller, I can buy a longevity bond from government. I will price my annuity today on the basis of the remaining, supposing I'm asked to price an annuity for a 65-year-old, I can price it on today's government actuary's estimate of the remaining life expectancy of 65-year-old men in Britain. So I can price it on the risk. And if the cohort outlives that expectancy, then the longevity bond, in other words, the taxpayer, will take up paying the annuity. So as an insurer, I cover the risk, the taxpayer covers the uncertainty, and that's a sensible division of labor, because private insurers find it difficult to cover uncertainty, except by charging a lot. Taxpayers are much better equipped. So I mean, that's the short answer for longevity bonds. In the face of that uncertainty, the alternative, as I mentioned, is, as in Sweden, the government sells the annuity.
Thank you. Other question, Nick, is if do you think mandatory contributions should link to the salary always?
Sorry, do I think mandatory contributions should be linked to salary?
To the salary, yeah.
I mean, yes, but up to some cap. I mean, it's ridiculous to expect Bill Gates to pay a mandatory pension contribution on every cent of his earnings. So there is a social purpose to pensions, which is that you want workers to have a replacement rate that makes sense given their previous work experience. But that ceases to be an issue for people who have very high earnings and very high wealth. So I'd say, yes, earnings related, but up to a maximum, and one can discuss what a maximum should be.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to informality. What would you recommend in the design of pension system in the case of countries with high labor informality? There's a solution? Must the country be formalized first? What do you think about the way to solve this problem?
If it was easy, it would have been solved. The World Bank has done very interesting work on that. They've got a very good document called a white paper published last year, which made the point that the formal sector contract of a full-time contract with your employer that lasts over many years is becoming less and less common. You've got workers in advanced economies, in the gig economy, you've got 0-hour contracts, you've got much more fluid labor market relations than in the past. And in that sense, the OECD countries are becoming less formal than they used to be. At the same time as developing economies are increasing the size of their formal sector, but there's a degree of convergence. And this idea of saying the norm is a Bismarckian pension where everybody has a full-time employment contract, and that's what developing countries should be aiming at, is misplaced. It's not like that. So the question is, how do you get workers, how do you design a pension system that covers informality as well? And there's two elements to that, one of which is well established, the other of which is still more an idea. The well-established bit is you have non-contributory pensions to provide a basis for poverty relief, which is what Peter Diamond and I advised the government of China to do. And that way it can be urban, rural, formal, informal. It has a very good gender gradient because women typically have a less good contributions record than men. So that's the well-established element. The bit that is experimental, but I think is very promising, is instead of basing pension contributions on income, you base them on consumption. And there's an experimental program in Mexico whereby, at the moment it's still voluntary, if I sign up for it, whenever I use my debit card or credit card at the supermarket, 1% of my supermarket bill goes to my pension fund, or 3% of my alcohol spend. There are experiments going on in other countries about basing pension contributions on consumption. I'm not saying it's easy, but consumption is harder to hide than income. So I'm not saying, well, hey, we've got a great solution here. What I'm saying is it's a very interesting idea, and I would warmly encourage international organizations to help sponsor experiments to see what might work. But bottom line, this idea that developing economies will become the 1960s Bismarckian ideal of Western Europe is pursuing something that was true, but it's gone. So it's chasing the wrong target.
Thank you. Some of the promoters of this Mexican approach are between a rat and this. Well, other question is, do you recommend a special default for the accumulation? As you mentioned, life cycles for accumulation.
If you don't make what theory tells us is that for a given accumulation, it is generally suboptimal to require workers to annuitize all of it. Partly, they may have liquidity needs, so they'd want some capital. They may have bequest motives. But there is a good case for either requiring workers to annuitize at least part, or at least nudging them to do so. Where you don't have a mandate to annuitize, then one needs certainly to nudge workers. And I've mentioned the US, which taxes drawing down too much or too little. Another would be to say, as you say, here is a default. And a default, one number one hears bandied around is 4% in real terms will cover you over an average retirement. But giving people clear guidelines would certainly be useful. And I'm not sure how a default would work, but clear guidance would certainly. The UK model of saying do what you like is wrong. And I think giving sensible guidance where you giving people sensible guidance is a good idea. How firm that guidance is, how high the tax penalties are for deviating from a central range is a design question, and I suspect also a political economy question that might vary from country to country. But so if not a single default, then certainly fairly strong guidance.
Okay. And unfortunately, the last one is there's much discussion in Latin America and elsewhere about the pros and cons of funded individual accounts versus funded collective funds, whether of the DB or of DC design, as if one precludes the other. Is there a real trade-off between these two designs, or can they complement each other?
Wow. I mean, when one talks about collective DC, there is a crucial distinction. If all workers are in a single DC pot, then you have the problem they have in the Netherlands, which is that younger workers who may want to take more risk can't do so, and older workers who want to take less risk can't do so. And in the Netherlands, this has led to political discontent, which is the genesis of not all workers in the same pot, but collective individual defined contribution says all workers of a given cohort are in the same pot, in the same fund, so that a cohort of young workers can take more risk than a cohort of older workers. So that's one distinction that needs to be made. Secondly, as Peter Diamond has said, you can have hybrids. I mean, NDC is a hybrid of defined contribution and defined benefit. The risk-sharing plan in New Brunswick has rules that say we are hoping to be able to pay you a career average defined benefit pension. And if the fund is in good enough shape, that's what we'll do. But if there is a projected deficit, then the rules say, here's what's going to happen. And what happens can affect contributions, accrual rates, and indexation of benefits in payment, which basically says it's a defined benefit plan, but contingent on fund performance, which makes it a hybrid between defined contribution and defined benefit. So the polar extremes of a final salary pension at one extreme and individual accounts chosen from competing providers on the other are different, but you've got a spectrum in between and you can have different combinations and they can merge. I don't know if that's an answer to the question. If it is, good. If it's not, sorry.
Thank you very much, Nick. Well, it has been a really pleasure, as always, to share with you this amazing morning. Finally, I would like to remind all participants that the recording of this conference and Peter's conference as well will be available online at the program's website shortly. And finally, I like to remind you as well of 2 days parallel sessions. We will begin in 55 minutes. You may choose one of the following topics: pension design and reforms, behavioral economics of pensions, and pensions finance. If you have not yet registered to obtain the Zoom link to join us, you can do it now by going to the program's website. And all of you, thank you very much for having participated with us in this first session. See you. Bye.
Bye.